Welcome to Capital Talks, your trusted resource for real news right now. I'm your host, Reina Rose, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Lucas Miles. Lucas is a writer, speaker, life coach, film producer, and senior pastor at Oasis Granger, president of the Oasis Network for Churches, which services churches in more than 10 countries, and author of his latest book, The Christian Left: How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church. Well, Lucas, that is quite a bold title, and I'm excited to unpack a little bit of what's in your book with you here today. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what led you to write a book with such a bold, I'm sure you're getting some flack from the other side on this title.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the cover is obviously a little spicy. You know, it's got this communist red and it's got the Christian socialism symbol on there. But first off, Reina, thanks for having me on the program. It's just a pleasure to connect and excited to be with you today. So I think a couple things. First off, this isn't the book I was setting out to write next. I had a book that I released in 2016 called Good God, the one we want to believe in but are afraid to embrace. And, it really is sort of a book that does PR for God, shows God that, shows that God is bigger and better than we think he is. And a lot of the wrong ways that I think religion has misconceived of God, and really kind of breaking down what is the gospel of grace. And as I looked at what am I going to write next, I was originally going to write a book about influence and really how do we grow in influence. But as I started seeing issues in culture rise up, and I started seeing this really ascendant problem within the church of the growth of progressive Christianity, I just felt like this topic was something I needed to tackle. And so I spent the last 2 years really diving into it, really trying to understand the difference between the emergent church and the progressive Christianity and liberal Christianity and the implications that we have for our faith. And what I've determined is that this is a really major problem. And I think that even with how this last election went, it's becoming even more so of an issue. And I felt like, this is God's timing's just been really on this book. And so I'm really excited just to bring this book, The Christian Left, to the world.
I've been enjoying reading the parts that I have been reading of your book. I've kind of done a very thorough skim.
Yeah, no, and, I understand.
What I love is you really are clear that there is a spectrum of right to left, that not everyone on the left is a baby killing heretic, and not everyone on the right, is a white supremacist bigot either, which is, I think, on both sides. And I talk a lot about that documentary, The Social Dilemma, and when we see too much of our side and live in an echo chamber, we get really distorted from reality. And your book really covers that. It really covers, like, you can go way too far into fundamentalism, and you can go way too far into just everything's okay, anarchy. And so can you talk to us a little bit about this spectrum of theology and politics?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So a couple things. First off, I think that as people, especially people of faith, we have a tendency to want to make this man from Galilee, Jesus, look a lot like us. We want to kind of create him in our image. And so if I have a propensity towards a certain direction, then I just kind of read scripture through that lens. And I think that's a fairly natural part of the human experience. When we look at something like specifically this thing of American politics, which is very different than politics in other parts of the world, and we have this, there's not multiple parties really. It's very binary, left, right choices that people have. You're right. We can go too far in these different directions. The traditional model of understanding the left and right is really kind of seeing it sort of as this line, that left is on one side, right is on the other side. And, as you get to the extremes of that, they're super far apart. I think that is a misunderstanding of really the human experience. Because in my opinion, something like, say, anarchy, which would be more associated with the radical left, and something like, say, maybe fundamental, Islamic fundamentalists, which would be associated more as a radical right position. When you get into a place to where they're both driving chaos, okay, then what you have is it's actually sort of this more of a circular model. And so we have what I would put things like a constitutional conservatism and kind of your traditional country loving, God fearing, left and right, Democrat and Republican up at the top and in various places. But then down here at the bottom, we have all these things that are bringing chaos, extreme Marxism, anarchy, fascism, radical Islam, these things that are really coming together and those things have more in common, even though we traditionally think of them as either left or right, than either one of them would with their left or right counterpart at the top of the circle. So I present this model in the book that I think is helpful to for us to recognize that where do we go wrong? Where do we depart from these things? And really what it's based on is the biggest danger, although we can get too far to the left or too far to the right, we can't get too far into the Word of God. And that's really what I'm hoping to do with this book, is bringing people back to, especially the church, back to a place to where they're grabbing a hold of scriptural truths and they're allowing that to guide their politics.
Absolutely. Many of our viewers have read my book as well. And, it's really at the end of the day, it's about praying and reading the Word for yourself so that you can discern the truth and the false on both sides, because both sides have true and false. And, when we get too far on either one, we can see it. But I do love, you have these diagrams in your book that you really show it in a visual way. So for those of us who are visual, we can see these diagrams and really understand the points that you're making. I want to talk really quick. You mentioned the last election, and we have this second impeachment of Trump going on. What is your opinion of that? Do you think that there's, it's like, look over here so that we can sleight of hand over there? Why would we be wasting our time and money on a second impeachment of a president?
Well, I mean, when you talk about DC, there's a lot of times where we go, why are we wasting our time and money on this? But, unfortunately, DC and I think that there are individuals there just very out of touch with the general nation and how the nation feels. We've lost some of these elements of representation, really of the people. And for me, I don't see anything constitutional about impeaching a president who is now out of office. It is now citizen Donald Trump, and not President Donald Trump. And so, like the impeachment clause, is not something that I would view as being applicable to somebody who is out of office. But the position that we're in right now, the left really has the ability to push through and kind of ram down the Republicans' throats just about anything that they want to do, because they have control, of all three, of the Senate, House, and of course the presidency. And so I think that, really, I'd heard Geraldo say today that, Kamala Harris is in a position where, she gets to really be the one kind of making that decision every single time, because we have a perfectly split Senate. And it's a concerning thing for the nation right now. We've been in this place before, with one party having the, kind of super majorities, but I don't think we've been in this place before with such a radical agenda happening. And so I'm not concerned about a season of Democrats being in power. I'm concerned about a season of Marxists being in power. And I think that's more of what we have right now.
Let's dive into that more after a short break and a message from our sponsors. Welcome back to Capital Talks, where I have Lucas Miles here, author of the book, The Christian Left, how liberal thought has hijacked the church. And we're talking a little bit about, right now, we're in a liberal presidency with the House and the Senate also being liberal, and this agenda. I want to talk to you about, okay, so if we're watching this show, probably right-leaning, probably somewhere on the spectrum, because I believe our viewers look at both sides. They're intelligent. They're making choices based on the Bible, based on seeing all the facts. How does someone who has right-leaning morals, right-leaning thoughts, in this time where they might be worried about a very aggressive agenda, how do they make a difference in this time?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think it begins with educating ourselves, and we live in a time. Paul writes to Timothy and basically says, "Don't give yourself to foolish controversies." And I think that I'm very much somebody who is a conservative. Very much, my votes always go right. They always go pro-life. I believe in biblical authority. All of these things. My career as a pastor and as a an influencer, but what we've seen among the right here of recent is a tendency to just kind of grab a hold of any kind of weapon, so to speak, that they can use against the left. And unfortunately, some of those weapons have been, I think, false narratives. They've been fake news. They've been clickbait things on social media. And, we haven't really taken our time to do our research. There are enough concerning things about socialism, Marxism, progressivism, that you don't really have to grab a hold of anything that is a conspiracy theory in order to, sound the alarm that these things are dangerous. And so, is there some elite group of people, controlling everything that happens in the world? I don't know. And frankly, it doesn't matter to me, because what we're seeing is there's enough day-to-day stuff in my local city and even in our local churches that we need to stand up against and we need to speak to. And so I think that, trying to bring Christians back to a place of truth is a really good place to start. Additionally, I think that we need to understand really what we're up against. We've seen the church, and I believe that if we can here's the issue, is that the left, in order to be able to continue to win elections, they have to divide the religious vote. And so in order to divide the religious vote, they can't just attack it from the outside. We saw that in the past. The left, seemed to be okay in the past with almost being referred to as a godless party. That's offensive to them now. They want to be seen as really the more spiritual, superior party. And we're starting to see, elements of that even with Biden's administration, a change in how they view religion among the left. They're hiring religion consultants. They're working with religious news outlets, in order to kind of change the narrative of the left. And they're really trying to win back, this view that Republicans are the party of God. And so the problem that's arising there is the left has realized that in order to split the religious vote, they actually have to kind of become part of the church, so to speak. And I call that in my book, this Trojan horse of progressive Christianity, or of the Christian left. And it's basically, they're giving these kind of gifts to the church in some ways, and things like social justice and speaking out against, topics that are important, things like racism, things like, immigration. And they're offering kind of this progressive view of these things, and really trying to begin to say things like, the real Jesus would be a liberal. I had somebody post on my page today, the real Jesus would be closer to Marx than he would be to, our founding fathers. And so the narrative is starting to change. And what that's doing is it's actually tearing the fabric of the church, and it's pulling a lot of people who in the past have probably voted right and been biblical Christians. They're getting swayed by this Christian left message. And it's really, it's really changing the face of Christianity, at least as culture understands it in our world today.
And so I want to dig into a couple of those, big topics. We got Marxism and socialism and abortion and these very controversial topics. And at the same time, I do feel like we have a dismantling of our history. I was looking into Thomas Jefferson the other day, because, they want to pull down the statue. And I'm like, he actually did so much. He ended the international slave trade during his administration. And though he owned slaves, had he sold them, they would have had a much worse fate than staying with him in his time. So he was doing what he could, right? So we have to see like history for what it is on one side. And then on the other side, we can see people saying, well, they thought it was okay to have slaves. And this is, I can see both sides on that. And yet we need to do our research, just like we do with our Bibles, to where we can't just be swayed by one verse or swayed by one little piece of that history. So I'm gonna just poke a few holes as if I was coming from the other side here. What about the people who are saying, okay, we're okay with a socialism looking model in something like the military, where you go into the military, you have free healthcare, free education, housing, and it looks like a socialism model, and we are absolutely fine with funding this, yet we're not fine with funding maybe our essential workers who are the backbone of our country in a very different way. Or people who might say, hey, we see a socialism, even capitalism in the book of Acts, where people are all putting their stuff together. And of course, though, I want to make a huge distinction between the communism we see in communist countries, and that is, one is by choice.
Yeah, so a couple things there. So, and anytime you talk about socialism or communism, it's a little bit anachronistic, meaning that socialism as we understand it, was not a term back in biblical times. But when you look at the book of Acts, and specifically, in the early chapters in Jerusalem, you see, and I actually address this in the book, and you see this, this time period where the church they're just, they're so excited, they're so in love with the Lord that they just start sharing possessions with each other. And it says that nobody has any possessions of their own, and they're selling things and giving to the poor. But here's the thing that people miss in that story is, if you trace Paul's ministry, and specifically you see this at the end of the book of Romans, you see some other places in scripture, Paul multiple times has to go around and take up collections for the church in Jerusalem because of the poverty that they've entered into. So for a time, they did kind of invent this sort of form of it's more communism than socialism. And they sort of existed in this for a time. But it actually put them in a very damaged spot financially. There was also a famine at the time, which contributed to it. But Paul had to go around and basically
Christians were being persecuted at the time. That didn't help.
Yeah, and it's to some degree. Persecution started a little later. It started in 64. To in Rome at least. But in Israel or in Jerusalem, it would have started slightly sooner than that. And so what we see is that socialism didn't work then, and it hasn't worked in every other single time that we've seen it applied in these forms. Now, people always want to point to Scandinavia and talk about democratic socialism and these things. There is still there's still high senses of capitalism in those nations. Something like the military you mentioned, people are choosing to go into, if an employer, if Google wants to offer some great package to their employees where they don't have to think anything and everybody makes the same amount of money, the beautiful thing about America is they're free to do that. My interest is really looking not so much at, what do corporations do or these things, but really helping Christians to understand the dangers of this progressive ideology. And socialism, modern socialism, progressivism, liberalism, these things all started outside of Christian thinking. And what I mean by that is it was atheists, it was dictators, it was warlords, it was, evolutionists that were coming up with these ideas. And you can and I trace this throughout the book, to really show the history of this, that there is not a biblical root to something like socialism or progressivism. I say simply, progressivism and Christianity are both, they're both on a journey. They're progress. They have progress in mind. Christianity has a destination in mind that is Christ. Progressivism has no destination in mind other than progress. And the problem with progressivism, what's radical today will seem normal tomorrow, and then they have to go even further. So they're not trying to get to anywhere. So that's a basic understanding.
So I love that. And after a short break, I do want to hit on, let me know what because I've heard this argument, from the other side as well. Well, they used this idea of it was too progressive to prevent slavery from being abolished, right? These were the same arguments. So after a quick break, let's hear your thoughts on that. Welcome back to Capital Talks, where we are here with Lucas Miles, and we were talking about the Christian church being hijacked by the liberal left in his new book. And he's doing a great job of walking us through some of the points in the books. And in the book, you'll see lots of diagrams that kind of help visually explain what's going on. But right before the break, we touched on, capitalism versus socialism and even communism in the Bible. And the very last thing we touched on is, what about when people make the argument, progressivism is good, we need this. People were trying to stop progression when slavery was being abolished. And these were the same arguments they were making back then. And that's the reason for the liberals to say, like, look, you're making these same arguments that people used to keep blacks out of the church, to keep gays out of the church, or, you know, whatever the progressive agenda might be. So what do you say when someone's, you know, because we want to hear both sides, but we want to, of course, love the other side and come in understanding, not just have a better debate than they do, right?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll say this to start with, you know, just maybe as a little bit of a disclaimer. So, you know, my expertise is in the area of church history and philosophy, and you know, I would not try to present myself as a historian that is just, you know, on maybe a topic like slavery or some of these other things, the way that maybe some people have some expertise. But what I will say is, from the research I've done, I do believe there's some really false narratives that are happening. You know, for instance, you know, when we look at something like slavery, it's rarely brought up that oftentimes some of the first slave traders that we have evidence of were you know, tribal leaders in African nations that were selling their own people or selling neighboring tribes, you know, to Islamic nations, or to, you know, to people within Europe or the West. Then the other thing that I think is not touched on very often is the attitude that Christians have had about slavery, you know, since the beginning of the church. There has never been really any sort of orthodox or biblical approval of slavery. This is, as Christians, we are against slavery. In fact, I know more Christians working to stop slavery today and human trafficking than any other group that I've seen. I'm curious to see how many people who are still talking about slavery from a couple hundred years ago are now putting their effort and time into stopping human trafficking. Do they believe enough in the abolition of this that they're going to continue the fight for modern day slavery that exists? I think that we have modern day slavery within, and it's a slavery of mind within the left and the Democratic Party, basically telling people, when Joe, you know, now President Joe Biden says, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black, you know, which was his quote, that is a form of mind control. It's a form of modern manipulation. And you could argue a form of kind of race-oriented slavery. Now, I don't want to minimize what happened, you know, in our nation's, you know, early years. What you see, I believe that our founding fathers made a great mistake. And the mistake that they made is they opted for initial unity, even though the majority of them were categorically against the idea of the slave trade. And so they basically felt like they had a choice, and we can see this in multiple writings and documents, that yes, we want to unite this nation. We've just broken away from England. We're trying to create something new here, and we could tackle this issue of slavery. It's an important issue, but you know what? We're going to get to that later, because first we're going to just solidify the states. And so they opted to solidify the states without dealing with that first. It would be much like, maybe, you know, you could have certain Republicans today say, hey, you know what, we're against abortion, but we're more for our nation being, you know, operating in unity and oneness. And so to prevent a civil war, we're going to kind of set that aside right now, and we're going to work together. Now, later on, I think in looking back in hindsight, you know, anytime that we acquiesce on our values in regards to things that really fall under biblical authority, dignity for human life, we're making a great mistake. So I do believe, although I believe that our founding fathers did some amazing work, and I mean, who knows? I mean, it was a difficult choice. I can't judge them from this point in history. It's hard to do that. But I wish there would have been a way that they could have dealt with that. And I know that there were many that felt like they should have. And so, and also we see people in England like William, you know, Wilberforce, who was leading really the charge as a Christian, as a pastor, to see that slavery was abolished, you know, did that first in England, had influence here as well. And so there is tremendous history and support to show that the church was against this then, and we're still against it now. And I think that's the position that matters, that this is not, you know, to lump everybody together, or to lump all of our founding fathers in one, or to ignore the Christian roots that many of our founding fathers had, I think is a mistake when we talk about this issue.
And I'm sure you're much more well-studied in your history on it than me, but even watching the play Hamilton, you know,
Yeah.
you see some key characters that would have helped abolish slavery die, you know, in the different sides of the war. And you think, wow, what if that person would have lived, would things have turned out a little bit differently? I want to touch on one more hot topic, actually two more hot topics before our last couple of minutes here. One, I want to talk a little bit about the stimulus package, especially as we're talking about socialism and different things. The COVID stimulus package, of course, the whole world is under crisis right now. Many people have lost their jobs. A lot of has been shut down without their consent, right? Business owners and so forth. So what do you feel about this stimulus? You know, it's a really tough thing because on one hand, it's so necessary. And on the other hand, can our economy afford to continue to stimulate itself?
I mean, so what, I mean, one author called, what we're seeing today kind of a soft totalitarianism that we have. It's you might also call it forced socialism. In hindsight, I think one of the greatest mistakes that Donald Trump did was, and I've been a supporter, of his historically, and I still am. But I think that he made a great mistake in shutting down the country, and that it provided the opportunity, it provided the canvas for a lot of socialistic concepts and ideals to really rise up. And it gave power to governors and gave them ammunition to be able to really become oppressive. We see that especially in places like New York and California and Michigan. And so, the stimulus that we're seeing now, because the government shut down, and because and I don't want to downplay, I'm not a COVID denier or anything like that. I had COVID. It was not fun. And I know that, for people with pre-existing conditions or in the right, age group, that it's something to take seriously. But this is the first pandemic that has ever been on the globe before that we have ever quarantined the healthy. Every other time there's been a pandemic, they've only quarantined the sick. And I think because of how they went about it, now we're in a position where you have businesses that are struggling, and it sort of forces the hand to really go to, that place and kind of, offer this sort of support. I think the Democrats are in a position that they can do whatever they want when it comes to these stimulus packages. Unfortunately, I think it's going to put our country in a lot of debt. I think that, is there some support that's needed? I'm sure that there is, because of the decisions that were made, with shutdowns. But the best stimulus package that we could have is opening up the country. The CDC just came out and suggested our schools open up. And, the press secretary refused to comment on it and said that they want to do some more research, and so the left is not in a hurry to get things open, despite some of their verbiage recently. And they need enough time to go by to show that they solved a problem that they're going to blame Donald Trump for causing, even though I think that they were very instrumental in creating the problem to begin with.
I have always been very floored being here in California, where we're so locked down that, Texas and Florida are wide open. People are going to Disney World, and they have about the same numbers we do. So our lockdown doesn't seem to be protecting us very much since these other ones. But I do think too, there's definitely a case for both sides, and I love to hear both sides here. And I think maybe had we locked down without airplanes flying back and forth, I feel like, we were doing a semi-lockdown, which only made people scared and upset, and small businesses shut down. And, I heard it put more crudely, but having people do air travel in the middle of a quarantine, it's kind of like sitting right next to a non-smoking section, and or right next to a smoking section, and you're in the non-smoking, you're still getting all the smoke. And so we like kind of shut down, but didn't. And so I think it's out of the bag. We can't put it back at this point, but we need to get opened up. We need to have businesses running. And I think it's really sad, the state that they've already been in. I've actually, in Orange County, I hope this doesn't get them in trouble, but they put signs up in the restaurant saying we're having a peaceful protest for small businesses to stay open.
And we need pushback. And this is this is one of the suggestions I give in the book, is that, and again, within this book, it's really helping the church recalibrate, but also as citizens within a nation, I address that as well. We have to find ways to peacefully push back. We have to find ways to peacefully, stand up for our rights. I mean, anybody who was concerned for their health always had the ability to stay home.
That's right.
They had the ability to do that. It would have been the same as if there was a lockdown. You could, and if support needed to be offered to people that because of their health conditions could not work. I think that that's a temporary fine thing for a government to do, to provide in a situation like a pandemic. But to force everybody else to not travel or to not work, who aren't
not
concerned,
open their business.
and to make those decisions for them, that becomes a really this soft totalitarianism, this socialistic sort of introduction into our nation. It's anti-American. More importantly, it's anti-scripture. And God is a God who has always valued throughout the word personal responsibility. And socialism, one of the greatest arguments against it, I think, is that it really disintegrates our personal responsibility and leaves us kind of dependent upon the state rather than dependent upon the Lord.
Well, thank you so much. That's Lucas Miles, everyone. Check out his book. Comes out May 2021. Is that correct?
Yeah, May 4th. It's available for pre-order now. It actually just hit number 1 on Amazon last week. Yep.
All right. So you can pre-order on Amazon and you'll get that book May 4th. That's The Christian Left, How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church by Lucas Miles. Well, that's all we have for today. Thank you, Lucas, so much for coming on. And thank you all for watching Capital Talks, your trusted resource for real news right now.